Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you are all sufficiently caffeinated. I know there are a lot of interesting conversations to be had today, but we are not done with our program, not by far. We have a lot of great stuff coming up. So thank you for sticking with us. Our next panel we'll be really diving into future industries and jobs, and this question of what do the jobs of tomorrow look like, how can we prepare for them, and really sort of pushing on that issue of like how do we get to that hybridization, and how do we understand adjacency and what's on the horizon. So your panelists today for this session are John Leonard, the Samuel C. Collins Professor of Mechanical and Ocean Engineering in the MIT Department of Mechanical Engineering, Ryan McPherson, the Portfolio and Investment Manager from Autodesk Foundation, Karen Mills, a senior fellow from the Harvard Business School, and Matt Siegelman, the CEO of Burning Glass Technologies. And your moderator is Liz Reynolds, the executive director of the MIT Industrial Performance Center and the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. We've had such a stimulating and interesting day and so much discussed already. But we hope we can add a whole new dimension to this discussion, particularly around what we see specifically around jobs and industries in our economy today. I want to start perhaps and just explain a little bit. My name up there says MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. And I think that it's probably worth a moment to just say that above and beyond the amazing work going on here with Erik Brynjolfsson's IDE and CSAIL, MIT started just last spring a new initiative that's an institute-wide initiative called Work of the Future, not to be confused with the future of work. But in any case, we are a 20-plus person task force building and pulling from across the institute, trying to bring the best of MIT to this topic and bring both the engineering and the social science side together to weigh in on an important area, which is obviously driving a lot of uncertainty and anxiety in our society, and a lot of questions. And so the thought was that with all the great work going on campus, could we actually increase our impact by bringing together a larger effort? And this is something that we hope to be communicating about and working on over the next 2 years. John Leonard is also on this task force, and Karen Mills happens to be on our advisory board. Erik Brynjolfsson, Daniela Roos, Tom Koken, others also on the task force. So I just wanted to set that stage before we begin. As I said, today we've had a lot of discussion around what's going on in firms, what's going on in terms of skills and education. This panel is really an effort for us to step back and say, well, what do we see on the horizon? What do we know about what's going on in some of our important industries in the economy? What does it tell us about what's happening in the near term and maybe the medium term? I think there are two things I hope we don't discuss on this panel. The one is the question about will there be work? Because I think we've tried to assert, certainly in our task force, that there will be work in the future. And as we've discussed today, the challenge is not will we create enough jobs, it's more about what's the quality of those jobs, who has access to those jobs. The second point is I hope we don't discuss numbers about how many jobs will be disappearing in the next 20 to 50 years. 47.5% of all jobs will be disappeared. I think that's actually not very helpful. What we know is that we live in a dynamic economy. We live in an economy that evolves over time, and that time differs across industries. It differs across locations. We know that as we talk about what's going on today, that we have to come up with responses, ideas, solutions to some of our challenges in the near term, in the next 5 to 10 years, not in what's going on in 20 or 30 years. So the focus of this group will be what's happening in the near term, what can we see on the horizon. So with that said, I'm going to first turn to our resident expert, I'd say, on the labor market today, Matt Siegelman from Burning Glass. Maybe, Matt, you could talk a little bit about Burning Glass, and also just you have sort of an overview of an incredible perspective on what's going on in this economy. Maybe you could step back and tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and this is a set of questions which we're lucky to have a unique vantage point on. Our work really is in what I like to call mapping the genome of the job market. It's a powerful metaphor because we're used to thinking about the job market in a sort of no-duh sort of way about being defined by jobs. And what we find, the substance of our work involves collecting literally millions of job postings every day from something like 60,000 different sites, hundreds of millions of people's resumes and online profiles every year, and then mapping them to a rich set of taxonomies across a bunch of dimensions. It's kind of stuff in this audience I can actually talk about. And then sort of aggregating up the signal, and what we see is this. When you look at thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of examples of a certain kind of job, you come to realize that a job is just a way of expressing a group of tasks, a group of skills. And so those skills form the genome of that job. And in that layer of skills, in the layer of that genome, is where you see the diversity of work. It's where you see the dynamism of work and how the market is starting to change. And it's also where we see the opportunities for people to get ahead and for employers to stay ahead and to be competitive. And as we look at that change in the genome, as we see the genome of jobs getting rewritten, and with increasing pace of dynamism, one of the most profound things that we see is not just the fact that Access, and yes, I'm old enough to remember Access, becomes SQL, becomes Spark, but what we see is actually a hybridization of skills. We see is that skills are essentially mixing together, such that jobs are increasingly calling for people to wear multiple different hats that don't normally get worn on the same head. And that presents a range of challenges to the market. Give you a quick example of that. Right? We know people who have gone into marketing. Marketing is a right-brain job, and marketing jobs overall are about as easy as professional jobs get to fill. We also know that among IT skills, SQL is likewise about as vanilla as they get. Now all of a sudden I want my marketing people to be able to manipulate my customer data. I want them to be able to do something as basic as query a SQL database, maybe construct that database, and those jobs become really difficult to fill and really challenge the supply chain of talent to the market, because the way in which people progress through their careers and the sort of vertical structures that have tended to dominate the way people are trained, the way people develop, and the people migrate through their careers don't necessarily align to a universe where skills are changing and where new skills like data, like coding, but also like business are inserting themselves into jobs in ways that are often orthogonal to traditional definitions of those jobs.
Very interesting. Karen, maybe you can reflect on that, on what we've just heard with respect to the financial services industry. As the former head of the SBA for the country, I think you have seen, particularly during post-recession and during recession, I wonder if you have some perspective on what's going on the industry and how all of this is affecting it.
Well, the area that I'm going to talk about today is fintech and how financial services are going to be affected by technology and what that means for the employment in there. I served as the head of the SBA during the financial crisis. So it's actually 10 years ago right now. So it's always worth taking a moment and remembering how far we've come from a time when credit markets were frozen and small businesses particularly couldn't get a loan. So fast forward to this era, we've got a much more robust credit market, but it's undergoing a whole set of transformations. And one of the things I want to mention is that there's a lot of talk about skills, but let's go to the industry side, the demand side, and say, how is artificial intelligence and data aggregation really at this moment? What industries are going to really change? And financial services, particularly banking, is going to have a huge transformation. And that's also going to be true in insurance and a whole set of other things. But just for example, if you think about small business lending, and I think it's helpful to do a bit of a case study on a few things. Small business lending used to be, you Xeroxed a pile of paperwork, you walked down the street, you gave it to a banker, the banker thought about it for 3 months maybe, came back and said no. What do you do today? You go online, you answer a series of questions. The machine sucks up your bank data, your credit card data, a whole set of other financial indicators, and in 3 minutes tells you yes or no, and the funding is in your account within a day. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? For a lot of small business owners, might be a very good thing. It certainly is changing the entire industry. So what happens today in the bank? We know what happened to the tellers. In the first wave of innovation, the ATMs took over, and so they weren't handing out the money anymore. But now, I was talking to a player in one of the banks. There's usually 2 folks. There's sort of an assistant manager and a branch manager. And the expectation is that they are going to be more connected to the customer. Because although you can create a lot of intelligence about creditworthiness, you can have unparalleled data. And we can talk about data privacy and who owns this data. I think that is one of the most interesting regulatory questions. But if you think about whether the machine is always going to make the right answer, one of the answers is, what about bias? If the machine learns from itself, it might not give more access and opportunity to underserved areas. If the machine just says yes or no, how do you make sure the business or the customer gets the loan that is right for them? And that's where the relationship comes in. So relationship banking used to provide some of this nuance. And I think what I'm seeing coming forward in this, I have a book coming out on this in the spring, is that, like in many things, the information will be more informative. You'll be able to have insights that you couldn't have before when you were just looking at a FICO score. But that, somebody said, can I get this loan? The machine can tell you yes or no. Should I take this loan? Should requires some kind of human judgment and conversation. And that's where I think there will be a rise of relationship banking, and there will be a whole set of people who perform that function, which could be these people in the branches.
Yeah. And we should mention the work that was done on the ATM ATM work, the classic case, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but maybe you want to just say exactly what happened with that. Basically, people thought when the ATM came in that we would lose all these jobs in terms of bank tellers. And we did lose some jobs, but we expanded the number of ATMs, we expanded the number of branches, and we expanded the work of the teller to relationships. And so now we, from an absolute point of view, we have more bank tellers or more relationship managers in banks than we had when the ATM came in. So it's an interesting case of how technology actually led to the upskilling, if you will. I know somebody didn't want to use that word last time, but moved people into this relationship arrangement.
So I think these AI, so just thinking about data aggregation and AI related to data aggregation, I think in many industries is likely to produce more job opportunities that relate to how you deal with the understanding the influence and the decisions that come out of this information.
Yeah, great. John, we're going to move to now a different part of the economy, if you will, and the autonomous vehicle mobility. I've learned to use the term mobility. We can no longer say automotive industry. I hope everybody knows that. It's a 21st century industry. It's called mobility.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I've been at MIT since 1991 and in many different roles in ocean engineering, mechanical engineering, and AI lab, the CSAIL lab. But in the last 2 years, I've been on a little adventure. I was on sabbatical helping to create something called Toyota Research Institute. And this is a group photo from a few weeks ago, our offsite, and we've grown from about 6 people in the beginning of 2016 to well over 200 now. And Gail Pratt is our CEO, Kelly Kay is our Executive Vice President. She's from Lyft. And we're really trying to help Toyota reinvent itself as a mobility company, embracing not just autonomous driving, but also robotics and using AI for material discovery. And I've had this sort of real amazing, enthralling, exhausting experience in industry helping create jobs. You know, like we have in this picture, actually, I know standing next to me, here's a new job category for you, autonomous vehicle operations specialist. The woman next to me in the picture, Sharon, is our our operations team lead, and we have about 20 safety drivers that help us with our vehicle fleet. And part of my message for autonomy is that, specifically for self-driving cars, is that I'm a bit of a contrarian. I think it's not going to come tomorrow or a year or two from now. It's going to take a lot longer, even though we have pilots with Waymo and so forth. And just as a little insight into using self-driving as an example, our approach at Toyota is to pursue 2 types of systems that use mostly the same software. A chauffeur system is, say, what Google or Waymo are trialing now in Mountain View in Arizona, where the car does all the driving and it's a bit like an autonomous Uber car. And I think that will come eventually, but it might take a lot longer to be widespread. For example, taking you from here to Logan Airport in a snowstorm or a rainstorm. And we're also pursuing something called Guardian, which is taking the technology and trying to use it sooner for improving the safety of cars. And just to liven things up a little bit, just something a little different, I'm going to show you a short video excerpt from a test we did about a year ago with this autonomous car. My 12-year-old has been coming to see autonomous vehicles at MIT for his whole life. I have pictures of him in his baby stroller next to our DARPA Challenge vehicle in 2007. And I brought him to Toyota when he was like 10 or 11. I said, do you want to see our autonomous car? And he said, Dad, seen one autonomous car, you've seen them all. But ours is actually a little different because we have 2 steering wheels. And so the reason we have 2 steering wheels is we can test the Guardian function while still keeping a safety driver. So I'm going to show you driving from the right-hand side on a closed course. And if you can play the video now.
Now we're going to demonstrate our Guardian system. We're going to emulate what happens when a driver falls asleep. Guardian can tell by using a camera that's part of the dashboard. The camera can even see through sunglasses in order to see what the driver's eyes are doing, or if their head is moving into a position that indicates they're not paying attention. So Ryan, whenever you're ready, why don't you go ahead and pretend to fall asleep. And now Guardian has stepped in, it's driving the car for you, and now it will offer at some point to give it back to you. Why don't you go ahead and take it now. One of the most frightening things that can happen on the highway is when a car in front of you switches lanes to avoid debris. You have very little time to react because your view is blocked by the car in front of you. We have sensors that can see significantly better than a human driver can see. The Guardian is going to take over where a car switches lanes in front of us in order to avoid debris. Here, that car switches lanes, Guardian decides we have to switch lanes also, and we avoid having a crash. Now Guardian has offered to hand back control, and Ryan has taken control back of the car.
So today you've seen demonstrations of 2 basic technologies that the Toyota Research Institute is doing research on.
This is all part of TRI's work to eventually build a car that can never be responsible for a crash, regardless of what the driver does.
So briefly for mobility, I think we need to envision ways to use the technology in concert with people. So making cars safer or having, say, a traffic jam assist sort of function, but the full autonomy might take a lot longer because of all the technical challenges. But in general, I think there will be new jobs that are at the interface of how we use the AI to complement existing tasks. But people are really good at some things. Robots are really good at some things, but bringing those capabilities together, I think there's a lot of opportunities.
John, I'm curious, there's been some of these reports that have been done about predicting what the impact is on jobs and things. And one of the comments that people make is that, in fact, when we have autonomous vehicles, we might expect a lot more congestion, that the cost of driving is going to go down. We're all going to hop in our autonomous vehicle to go get a bottle of milk, and it's going to create all these problems that actually going to result in more need for either regulation or for monitoring this, or that negative outcomes that aren't so ideal.
I think it's entirely possible. I think about the Mass Ave Bridge on the day when the Red Sox are playing and how congested everything is, and what will that be like in 20 years? And but I think I think the short version is that we don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty. We're sort of planning in the face of uncertainty. But I think that we have to. For me, it's about mixed emotions. On the one hand, I worry that the challenges are really hard and it might take a lot longer. On the other hand, the investment is so great that it's coming. And how do we sort of move forward with the two ideas at the same time and still function? So hopefully the outcomes will be better.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I mean, you are working in so many different building-related, Autodesk touches a lot of the building-related industries, which have been profoundly affected, I think, by this technology, and also are really reflecting a tremendous amount of growth. I mean, if you think about the fast-growing industries right now in this country, we've got the wind at our backs in both construction and in manufacturing, a lot going on. What do you see from your vantage point about what's going on in those industries and how this technology is affecting work?
Sure. Thanks, Liz. For those who might not be familiar, Autodesk is a technology company that creates software tools for people who make things. So architects, engineers, construction managers, all the way to movie producers. So it kind of runs the gamut. And so because of that, we do work quite a bit, and our customers work quite a bit in the built environment. I'm going to put a little bit of my futuristic hat on, and I promise to take it back off again really quickly and stay as pragmatic as possible. But the things that we're seeing in the built environment are certainly a significant growth. And we call that the inevitability of more. And so what I mean by that is in 2030, or 2050, so in 30 short years, that there are going to be 10 billion people on this planet, 75% of whom are living and working in cities, and a lot of those simply just haven't been built yet. And if we're to follow the forecast, it's somewhere around 5,000 buildings that need to be created each and every day looking forward to be able to meet that demand on a global level.
I don't want to be in the traffic jam around that. I've had enough already.
Yeah. It'll make the Red Sox games pretty interesting
Yeah.
at that point. What you're also seeing is that, bring that back to today, is that in the construction industry specifically, that there's a dearth of talent available, as well as a lot of competition around cost. Because of that, these construction professionals are looking at automation and influencing or updating their own workflows to be able to meet that demand with the reality that we simply need to do so with less negative impact on the planet and given these constraints that we have right now. And so what we're sort of seeing there is a convergence between construction and manufacturing, where construction has been all about one-off projects, high customization. Every single project is its own unique snowflake. Here in the manufacturing sector, it's traditionally been about throughput and commoditization and making sure that efficiency is gained. So when you are starting to apply these manufacturing principles in construction, what you end up seeing is a complete revamp of the way in which things are made, which opens up opportunities to be able to make new things. So when you're designing a building to be manufactured, manufacturing that building in a factory, and then assembling that building on site, the types of tasks that you are going to perform to help make that successful are going to evolve and change. And to kind of put maybe a specific case study on that, on the design side, a traditional building designer might think about all of the different parameters that are really important to success for this project. Cost certainly is really important. The types of materials, the space that you're going to be making this, all the where the sun is shining, et cetera. That designer will come up with 2 or 3 different permeations on what might work in the real world, and then take that forward to be built. using generative design and some of the principles that are being applied today, you can put in those parameters and let the computer run through tens of thousands of different permeations. Then you think about that designer and her role and her tasks that she's going to be performing and the skills that she needs to be successful. It changes a little bit. So she no longer is sitting there pen to paper or working a computer-aided design program to come up with these designs. She is looking at the 6 or 7 different designs that were created by the computer and putting her professional judgment on those and thinking about the context in which these projects are going to be applied so that they can be successful.
Wow. You know, I think about construction, it reflects in some ways what you're describing, a lot of what we see in terms of actual growth of jobs right now. So on one hand, the frontier jobs we talked about all day long, the data science, et cetera, those jobs we see a lot of demand for. But we also see a lot of demand for the last mile job, which is not necessarily high skilled, but it's the Amazon packaging, it's the construction worker who's on site, who has to actually install the modular home or modular piece. It's also, broadly speaking, in what we refer to as social skills. So in any sort of job that requires interaction with people, we know that there's real growth now in nurses, teachers, social workers, et cetera. And when you can combine, as we were talking before with Matt, combine the STEM skills with the social skills, that's really where we see a lot of demand. The other area that I will mention is, of course, in the lower wage service economy, we see a lot of growth as well. And we have what we also call the wealth jobs. This is a term that David Otter uses, which is with people having more disposable income, they now have not only a dog walker, but a pet psychologist. And so the pet psychologist, there's a lot of growth in that area as well. But Karen, you've worked a lot on this issue of manufacturing versus services, and we see a lot of this service side. What's going on there?
Well, before we go to manufacturing and services, I want to just do a thought experiment about a point you just raised, which is what's going to happen on Main Street. So let's assume that everything else has a lot of automation. Is it possible that you are going to really want to go get coffee at a place where people gather? And is this perhaps the beginning of a whole new set of Main Street entrepreneurs and innovation and opportunity, because people might have more leisure time, they might have the desire to have community. And that's, old-fashioned wise, that's what happened on the old Main Street. So one of the predictions that I have in the back of my head is that all of this automation actually leads to more Main Street jobs. You made the point, though, that they have tended to be fast-growing now, but low wage, and increase the job polarization. So you can see this job polarization continuing to be an issue as this sort of high-skilled data scientist matched with a decision-maker, social-skilled, multi-layered person gets a lot of money, and there's a high demand for the community jobs, but maybe not so much wage. Yeah. Now, you asked me about another favorite topic of mine, which is how, in this new future of AI, manufacturing comes out versus services. We spend a lot of time talking about what's going to happen in the factory when the robots take over. But the much more interesting trend, I think, is what's happening in the service economy. I just spent 3 days in Europe with supply chain people. And if you want to take an industry where AI is going to transform things sooner rather than later, besides financial services, it really is in this supply chain. Because once again, it's a place where you take unfathomable amounts of information, the matrix on Walmart of every SKU in every location, with every supplier in the supply chain, and you try to figure out how to make that shorter cycles, less money in inventory, less cost through the whole system. And then you add on to that the biggest piece of the supply chain that's growing is the services component of the supply chain. And you start to put that through, then I think what we will see is a really dynamic and interesting transformation of what's happening in the supply chain, how knowledgeable we are about what we need to buy when. And I think it will bring supply chains more back to the local environment. I think that the availability, the connectivity between suppliers will value flexibility, that will benefit smaller entities, that you'll be able to make job lots better, whether it's with new technology or just better forecasting, and that this could, for the United States economy, but also for many economies, quite change the employment picture, and we really haven't yet factored all of that in. But that, I think, is it's like an under the covers, if you want an under the covers place that AI is going to have a huge impact now, day to day to 2, 3, 5 years. It's the effect that the new intelligence and systems will have in the supply chain.
That's fascinating. I will say that as part of the project on Work of the Future, we were out in Ohio this summer interviewing small and medium-sized manufacturers. And what we saw was this introduction of new technologies, not in replacing workers at all. And of course, we've got a strong wind at our back, but really about increasing the productivity. This was the point Fred Goff made yesterday, previous panel. But ways in which workers were being very much empowered with the new CNC machines or with the new software or all of this. And so the fact is that manufacturing jobs have been declining, but at the same time, we're seeing this technology, I think, really have potential for at least stemming that decline and potentially growing manufacturing. I don't know, John Leonard, if you have some reflections on that. I mean, you've been sort of on the front line of looking at factories and automation. Do you see this technology? I mean, the automotive industry is renowned. It brought in robots decades ago. This is not a new story for automotive, is that right?
Yes. When I was in college at Penn, I worked 2 summers at a General Motors factory in Delaware where they installed a lot of robots on the assembly line, and I got involved in some of the dealing with workers that were getting robots brought in and all the sort of dynamics of that. And in fact, I wrote my essay for getting a fellowship to go to grad school in England on the topic of robots taking jobs. So, but
it all comes full circle.
I've lost it. I don't know.
Taking jobs for a long time.
I'm glad it worked for you.
But but I think as a roboticist, I think there are great, leaving aside driving, the physical work with your hands, manipulation, is just so hard. I think there's a lot of researchers looking at, say, things like the Amazon picking challenge, where you might be able to pick up objects. But I think of all the occupations where, like, real, true dexterous physical work, it's just so hard. I think it could take many decades of robotics research to truly replace sort of dexterous tasks.
We just had a number of community college presidents here on campus, and we were talking about what their challenges are. And of course, their big challenge is they're trying to figure out what they should be educating for the future. But what they say right now is they are completely out of, short on training for all of the trades. We cannot find enough welders. We do not have enough electricians. They don't have the pipeline because in some ways people were sort of not aware of the need here, or kind of looking at that 4-year education that has been so emphasized. But in fact, I think this using our hands and getting people on the trade side employed is right now the demand for that seems to be quite significant. So one of the topics I think that is important to bring into all of this, and it permeates the entire day's conversation, is around the pace of change. There's a great phrase about the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that that's something that's important to think about when we think about the introduction of these technologies and how they're changing jobs and how they're changing the demand in the future. What we know is that a lot of new job growth today has nothing to do with this new technology. Some of it really does, but some of it doesn't. And it's being introduced at very different paces across industries and in different locations. And I wonder, Matt, I mean, you've got to be, real time seeing these changes on the demand side happening. What's your impression, and how has our labor market worked to date with respect to this issue of timing and changes in technology?
So I think some of this comes back to the question of hybridization and also of the dynamism with which the genome of jobs is getting rewritten. We see, obviously, across jobs, significant pace of change, and I'm glad, Karen, thanks for bringing us to the question of service workers. Across both some of these phenomena that we tend to sort of think about as being really just the provenance of high-tech work, of jobs in the new economy, are also forces that are rewriting the skills of middle skill and sometimes low skill jobs. We know that from our research, we know that among middle skill jobs, again, these are jobs that are sort of north of high school, south of college, 80%, when you actually read the tasks that employers are laying out, 80% of those jobs today are what we would classify as digitally intensive. And the jobs that are digitally intensive among those middle skill jobs are growing twice as fast as those that are not, are twice as likely to pay a living wage. And so these are forces that are profoundly changing things across the board. That said, I think, to your question about sort of pace of change, obviously there's some sectors that are moving faster than others. For those of you who haven't seen it, David Deming recently did a wonderful paper looking at this question of the obsolescence of skills and how that affects the kind of premiums that those in the STEM economy command. And what he found is actually that that premium decays very quickly, mostly because those of us in the STEM world are just renting out skills. The skills change. We never actually get a premium for having those skills because they age so fast. Now, there are jobs that change less fast. And again, we go back, as much as there are significant rewrites in the DNA of service work and other kind of work, those jobs have tended to be more static. Now, I think the real question then is how do we, is not so much the pace of the change, but what's the capacity to absorb the change? And different, at least in the STEM economy where people are paid well, people have good access to information and can therefore sort of track what's the skills I need to learn in order to move ahead. There are parts of the economy where people don't have access to good information, where people don't have the financial wherewithal to invest in themselves. And so there's a set of policy questions that are really important. There's also a set of questions for employers here that have to do with the capacity to absorb change. If you're an employer, we all want to be sort of out in front and leading edge. And we were talking about this a little bit before. There's nothing wrong with being a fast follower. In fact, there's a lot of advantages to being a fast follower. And so, what are the bellwethers doing, and what does that tell me about how others in my industry are changing, about how specific jobs in my company are likely to change? And how do I make sure now that I'm planning out a pipeline of talent, whether engaging with community colleges, whether by investing in learning and development in ways that align with where things are going. I shared before the example of two car companies, mobility companies, John.
Mobility, please, please.
Ford just bought a scooter company today, so it truly is mobility. Right. And looking at job postings for GM and at Tesla, both looking for mechanical engineers. Now, they're both mobility companies. They are doing similar kind of work one would expect. The DNA of those jobs are fundamentally different. GM talks about systems engineering. They talk about Microsoft Excel. They talk about engineering support. Tesla's talking about product design, product development, CATIA, simulations, other kinds of things. Now, I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm not going to try to weigh in on which side of that divide I'd want to be on, but I subscribe, as I often say, to the Wayne Gretzky school of talent development, which is you want to skate to where the puck is going, right? And so this is an opportunity for companies to say, where is the puck going? and how do I skate to there now?
So I think Matt raises a really important point here, which is in the supply and demand equation that's coming. We talk a lot about the supply, and here are these poor training programs in community colleges trying to keep up and figure out what's going to happen. I think the people who are absent at the table are really the business side. And I think businesses are not doing a very good job about thinking about their workforce of the future, and those who are going to have competitive advantage. And the corollary to that is that a lot of people might be thinking about it in the C-suite, but HR is not invited to the C-suite, and HR is not connected to the job description that the new business is going to require. So they are kind of the last to know, and they don't really know what to do with the demand side. So as a result, there's no clear demand signal down to the supply, and the poor kid going to the community college has no idea what skill, what STEM skill gets them a job, or what capacity that they could develop that's not a four-year degree would leave them competitive in the future. So I think in this supply-demand equation, there's clearly too much friction, and the people who can solve it are the businesses, and it's in their interest to do so. So we should give them a little kick to get going.
Okay.
Just quickly to add, it seems like the pace of change is influenced by the demand equation, and I agree that the private sector needs to do a better job of signaling how that's moving. It seems like the absorption to this change is driven by the supply side. A lot of that is mentality. One of the things that we found that was really interesting, and we're quite early in our research here, but there seems to be an inverse correlation between exposure to technology and fear of technology when you're thinking about construction and everything from those who are the frontline laborers to those who are middle management. And so those who have seen technology augment some of their tasks tend to be more techno-optimists and think positively about the future and have a greater absorption for this change, while those who perhaps don't use technology in the day-to-day are a little bit more techno-pessimist and feel like robots are going to take their jobs.
Defensive, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I want to make sure we have very little time left, but if there are a couple questions from the audience, I think we're happy to take one or two at this point. Yes.
Well, actually, I have one for Ryan and one for Karen, if that's okay. For Karen, small business creation in this country has declined from what it was a generation ago. It started about 15 years ago, and it stayed there while you were in the office. It's there under the current administration. What do you think caused that, and what do you think could change that?
So you raise an issue that I think about a lot, and that's troubling, which is that there's two things going down. The rate of small business creation is actually down. We used to do about 500, 600,000 new businesses a year. Now we do about 450 to 500,000. So fewer small businesses are being created. And they're a smaller percent of the rest of the businesses. There's been a ton of research done on this. There's all kinds of theories and no conclusion. There's everything from too much student debt to not enough financing to the fact that Walmart has taken over some of the Main Street small businesses. Now, this entrepreneurial decline is not happening in Silicon Valley. It's not happening in the very small high tech. It's happening really in what I call the Main Street and the local businesses. And we don't know the effect of that yet, but in the Schumpeterian terms, if you have more creative destruction, you have more dynamism, and that is definitely at risk. So the answer is, it's definitely happening. We don't know why.
And we don't know how to fix it.
And we don't know how to fix it because we don't understand the root cause. Some people say there are just fewer new entrants. It's a labor force issue, and Pugsley says that, and I've looked at it all, and I have to say I don't have the answer.
And a quick question for Ryan.
Okay.
I've heard you guys talk about increasing productivity in construction, but the numbers, productivity growth in the construction industry have been dismal for decades.
Yeah.
Why?
There is a lot of inertia in the system, as we've talked about here in terms of the pace of change that is keeping things from moving to that future state as quickly as perhaps the dialogue might be. So I think MIT probably knows better than anyone the two sides of that equation, which are the rate of technology adoption, but also where the technology development is today. And that just simply is inundated by the inertia.
I don't have the answer to that, but I will say that I think it's about industrial organization. The way that the construction industry is organized, from what I understand, commercial, residential, et cetera, really makes it difficult to make those gains. Okay, another question.
I just would like, excuse me, I'd like to talk a little bit about secondary effects, or ask a question about secondary effects. Karen talked about that with respect to consumers' demand for greater flexibility and timing and so forth that could result in more small-scale delivery. But I would say that it's important to look at some of the evidence about how the big successful innovation hubs and what has happened. A book that was written a number of years ago, not that many, about 6 years ago, called The New Geography of Jobs, put together a lot of information about what some of the effects of the innovation hubs was on the economy in general. And the high-tech sector has a multiplier effect of 5, on an average of 5. For every job created in high-tech, there are 5 that are linked to it. And a lot of those jobs are jobs that are due to people who want to live close to where they're working, and they want to have restaurants, and they want to have nice fashionable shops, and they want to have a whole bunch of things, including timely delivery. But these things are going to be more labor intensive, they're going to be more skill intensive, but the skills are different. And there's another factor here too, and that's transportation infrastructure. Right. Is that as this process goes on, the transportation structure looks more and more inadequate, and that has a lot of consequences for how things will happen as secondary effects, not the primary effects.
Thank you for your comment.
I'm sorry, that was more of a statement than a question.
No, that's all right. We appreciate that. But I'm going to unfortunately have to stop there. We are running late, and I've got the, Christy kind of barreling down on me here. But if you will, please join me in thanking our panelists.